If a nation's wealth and power were to be measured in stubbornness, resilience, and inventiveness rather than GDP, Scotland would be a top 5 superpower. The people that brought you televisions, refrigerators, penicillin, and gin and tonic have gone through many a rough patch throughout their history. Very often, hard times were related to their rocky relationship with their southern neighbours, the English. In today's exploration, we're going to look at an example that sums up all that we just described. This was Scotland's only attempt at colonialism, one that was funded on a sound business idea but eventually turned into a failed utopia. Welcome to today's Geographics, covering the Darien venture, also known as New Caledonia, or the colony that bankrupted Scotland. Allow me to begin with a straight-up geography lesson. What is the Darien and where can you find it? Well, the Darien Isthmus is a region in modern-day Panama, the narrow strip of land that connects Central America to the Southern American landmass. From above, the region looks like paradise on Earth, with its gentle hills, luscious rainforest, and access to both the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. On the western coast, the region overlooks the sheltered Bay of Darien, perfect for mooring ships and fishing. Our story takes place at the close of the 17th century. Back then, the Darien had been home to the Kuna people, at least until the Spaniards arrived. The Spanish Empire still ruled much of the American continent and the Atlantic trade routes, threatened only by the proximity of English colonies in the Caribbean. Now, as far as colonies go, the Spanish didn't show much interest in the Darien. I mentioned it looked like a paradise from above, but on the grounds, the place was quite inhospitable. The same lush jungle that looked so enticing from above made it quite difficult to farm land and establish permanent settlements. Still, the isthmus had great strategic and economic potential. Before the Panama Canal was opened in 1914, merchant and naval fleets coming from the Atlantic, they were forced to circumnavigate all of South America, sailing down to Cape Horn of the Magellan Straits before turning north again. This was a very long and perilous trip. There was an alternative, though, an idea ripe for implementation. What if some entrepreneurial settlers would offer to unload cargo in the Bay of Darien, transport it across the jungle to the Pacific coast, and then load it onto another ship? Well, those people, whoever they were, would make an absolute fortune. At the close of the 17th century, a concrete business plan for such an adventure materialized in the least likely of nations, one not traditionally associated with overseas conquest, and that was Scotland. So how about a short lesson on Scottish history now? Scotland had been an independent kingdom for centuries. In 1603, King James VI of Scotland, of the House of Stuart, ascended to the English throne. From then on, he was known as James I in England and James VI in Scotland. This was certainly something that confused foreign ambassadors at the time. Scotland and England found themselves in a relationship known as the Regal Union. In other words, the two countries had separate independent parliaments and administrative systems, but they shared a king. The Scottish Parliament had always resisted complete subordination to English authorities, favouring a federative union instead. Following the victory of the Roundheads in the English Civil War, Oliver Cromwell had imposed a forced union of Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and England, a union that few really wanted. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, King Charles II reverted to the old status quo. The English Parliament made another attempt at a full political union in 1689, but the Scottish estate rejected the proposal. Scotland defended its independence, even if it still shared a monarch with England. But in order to maintain independence, a nation needs, among other things, a solid economy. And that's something that Scotland could rarely boast. At the end of the 17th century, the Scottish economy was in a state of crisis. Years of famine had driven farmers away from their lands. Homeless vagrants choked the cities looking for work, but ultimately starved to death in the streets. The nation's trade with continental Europe had been crippled by the Crown's wars. From 1672 to 1678, England allied with France and Sweden against the Dutch Republic and Spain. Then, in 1688, a new faction emerged in Scotland, the Jacobites. These were full-on independence seekers who wanted to separate once and for all from the rule of the then King of England, William of Orange. The Jacobite uprising was part of a larger conflict known as the War of Grand Alliance. This Grand Alliance, of which England was part, fought against France, which could count on the Scottish independentists on its side. By the mid-1690s, Scotland was in a weak position, ripe for total absorption by King William. Even non-Jacobites who had been against total independence still treasured the autonomy of the regal union system, and, well, they were at risk of losing it all. Scotland desperately needed to revive its depleted economic fortune before it got swallowed up by its rich southern neighbour. And this is where a man with a plan enters the picture. This man was a financial adventurer called William Paterson, a Scot who had built a reputation in London by founding an institution still active today, and that's the Bank of England. Ironic, I know. Whilst in London, Paterson had made friends with a sailor named Lionel Wafer. This sailor captivated Paterson's attention with tales of a fantastic land on the other side of the Atlantic, a wonderful paradise overlooking a bay of calm waters, blessed by rich, fertile lands and populated by tribes of friendly natives. This land of milk and honey was called Darien. When Paterson returned to Edinburgh, he started hatching an ambitious plan to jumpstart Scotland's economy. If trade with Europe was languishing, why not move to where trade was thriving? Paterson would turn Scotland into a colonial trading power in the Americas. What could possibly go wrong there? I hinted at this a bit earlier in the video. Paterson immediately realized the true potential of the Darien Isthmus, as all major European naval powers were attracted to the lucrative markets in China, Japan, and the rest of Asia. But the way to get there was prohibitively long, expensive, and dangerous. Now, the purpose of traditional colonies was to exploit newly occupied lands, to seize local goods to sell elsewhere, or to provide an additional market to absorb goods and workforce from the motherland. Paterson's plan was way more original. The colony he had in mind would be entirely dedicated to transporting land cargo from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific one and vice versa. Paterson's enterprise would charge a nice fat fee for their transport services, but this trading route would still be cheaper and safer than the traditional circumnavigation of Cape Horn. In more poetic terms, Paterson claimed that Darien will be the door of the seas, the key of the universe. So, well, were there risks involved? Well, of course there were. But how can one make a profit without incurring any risk? In this case, the risk took the shape of Spanish colonial troops armed to the teeth, something that modern-day startups only occasionally have to face. If you ask me, the business proposition was actually a pretty good one. Indeed, I'd probably have invested my hard-earned cash as well. And as it turns out, Scots in 1695 shared this enthusiasm. The idea proved hugely popular. So in June, Paterson founded the Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies. There was a great rush to buy shares, both north and south of the border. It was sort of a Bitcoin of the 17th century, if you will. Or should I say, a bit doubloon. A risk that startups normally face is protectionism and resistance from more established companies. This case was no different. The English East India Company, fearing the loss of its monopoly on British trade to the Indies, pressured the English Parliament, which threatened the new company with impeachment. This threat of legal action eventually forced English investors to withdraw. The East India Company and the English authorities went as far as to threaten to embargo any merchant who attempted to trade with Paterson. With such opposition and a boycott in England, Paterson went public in modern terms, and he expanded the sale of his shares to Scottish people from all walks of life. Thousands responded to the call, and within 6 months, Paterson had raised £400,000, which in today's money is about £43 million, or about $54 million US. A useless bit of trivia here: in those days, that amount of cash could either buy you 74,000 horses or 96,000 cows. You could also purchase and outfit 5 ships for an expedition to Panama, which is exactly what Paterson did. The names of these ships alone evoke swashbuckling tales of seafaring adventures: the Unicorn, a mythical beast; the St. Andrew, Scotland's patron saint; the Caledonia, the Latin name for Scotland; the Endeavour, the English synonym for enterprise. And then there was the Dolphin, the intelligent fish. Next, Paterson proceeded to adequately kit out his ships. Surely he must have stocked up on cannons, muskets, rapiers, and cutlasses. Well, wrong. In fact, here's a list of the inventory. First, some pistols. See, I told you, pistols are vital if you need to swash and buckle. What's next? Well, axes, spades, and flooring nails. Well, you always need tools to build a new colony. And how are we going to carry them? With 3 horse-drawn carriages. Well, that's sorted then, but there's no mention of horses. Well, the list continues with a series of household items, such as knives, 9 smoothing irons, 94 bed covers, 10 cups. And I agree with the smoothing irons because nobody ever colonized Central America with a wrinkled shirt. Speaking of clothing, the 5 ships also stocked 85 ceremonial wigs, 2,000 hats, 1,301 pairs of slippers, and 324 pairs of women's gloves. And here I was starting to wonder if those Scots got their priorities right. Last but not least, they carried with them hundreds of combs and mirrors. These were to be used as currency to trade with friendly natives, described by Wafer. So apparently, Europeans trading mirrors and trinkets with Native Americans was totally a real thing. But would they accept this type of currency? At this stage, it appeared that Paterson and co., as brilliant businessmen as they may be, were completely unprepared for a lengthy colonial ordeal. On the 4th of July in 1698, sunshine over Leith Harbour bade farewell to Paterson's small fleet. The 5 ships set sail under the command of Captain Robert Pennockigh, with 1,200 would-be settlers on board. Paterson and Pennockigh managed the departure with utmost secrecy, surely to prevent interference from the East India Company. In fact, they were the only 2 travellers with knowledge of their final destination. This was revealed to everybody once they were at open sea, and they were allowed to open the sealed packages handed over by the captain. The ship sailed 500 miles and then 500 more, and so on, until they made landfall at Darien on the 2nd of November. During the voyage, the party had lost 70 of their original crew. As sad as this may sound, this was actually quite a good ratio for sea travel at that time. Optimistically, they renamed the Darien Peninsula as New Caledonia, or New Scotland, not to be confused with the French colony of the same name in the South Pacific. The colonists set to work building a settlement, although their first choice of location was not ideal. Paterson described it as such: a mere morass, neither fit to be fortified nor planted, nor indeed for men to lie upon. After 2 months of clearing the jungle and building rickety huts, the settlers found a better location. The new spot was more suited to building defensive structures, and it became known as Fort St. Andrew. Within the fort stockade, they began erecting their living quarters, which they christened New Edinburgh. This new position may have been more defendable than the previous one, but the other problems remain. It became clear that the colony would not be able to sustain itself. The land was unsuited to agriculture, and the Kuna natives were uninterested in trading their food for combs and mirrors, which must have been a massive shock. The New Caledonians held on for almost a year before the adventure took an ugly turn. In the spring of 1699, the colony was beset by constant torrential rain and tropical infectious diseases. By March, more than 200 colonists had died, and the death rate had risen to more than 10 per day. Supplies were running short. Paterson and Pennockigh dispatched their 5 ships to nearby colonies in the hope of trading with them. 4 ships returned empty-handed, except for a piece of bad news. All English ships and colonies had been forbidden to trade with the Scots by order of the king. The 5th ship, the Dolphin, did not return at all. It had been captured by the Spanish, with its crew imprisoned. The young settler Roger Oswald described in vivid detail that hellish spring on the Darien Peninsula. He described how everybody had to survive on less than a pound of mouldy flour a week. When boiled with a little water, without anything else, big maggots and worms must be skimmed off the top. Yet, for all this short allowance, every man daily turned out to work by daylight, and so continued until 12 o'clock, and at 2 again, and stayed till night. My shoulders have been so wore with carrying burdens that the skin has come off them and grew full of boils. Our bodies pined away and grew so macerated with such allowance that we were like so many skeletons. Even William Paterson's wife and only child died in Darien, to say nothing of his hopes of reviving Scotland with a brilliant business plan. Just when things could not get any worse, more bad news reached the colony. The Spanish, whose colonies bordered Darien, were planning an attack on New Caledonia. The settlers were in no position to fight off an invasion. As panic spread, they decided to abandon the settlement. The return voyage was not as lucky as the first one. Of the 4 remaining ships that abandoned the colony, only the Caledonia made it back to Scotland, with less than 300 souls on board. While Paterson and the remaining survivors were returning to Scotland, a second expedition was being readied by his company. The second wave of colonists, of course, knew nothing about the disaster that had struck their predecessors, and so they set sail in August of 1699. This was a smaller fleet of 3 ships led by the Rising Sun, but it carried a larger force of 1,300 settlers. 160 died in the crossing. After 4 months crossing the Atlantic, the second expedition found Fort St. Andrew and New Edinburgh completely abandoned. It was a ghost town. But these Scots would not easily accept defeat, so they just got on with rebuilding New Caledonia. But this second attempt did not fare better than the first. Disease and malnutrition were again the main scourges, with an added problem. There was a complete collapse in discipline. This was understandable given the terrible circumstances in which these poor souls had to survive, but this barbarity scandalized Reverend Archibald Stobo, one of 3 Presbyterian ministers in New Caledonia. He wrote, "Our land hath spewed out its scum. We could not prevail to get their wickedness restrained, nor the growth of it stopped." He went as far as claiming that the tropical diseases and starvation were just the punishment of God for the wickedness perpetrated by that scum. Despite Reverend Stobo's best efforts, it was not prayer that curbed societal collapse, nor his sermons that rallied New Caledonians together, but rather an external threat: the Spanish. The first expedition had only been threatened with an invasion, but now the menace was real. News reached the Darien of a massing of Spanish troops in nearby Tobacanti. Surely that was in preparation for a deadly strike. A young colonel, Alexander Campbell, took matters into his own hands and persuaded the colonists to launch a preemptive strike against the Spanish. Campbell's second-in-command, Lieutenant Turnbull, even managed to recruit some natives into the expedition. The leader of Tacuna, rechristened Captain Ambrosio, had always been a supporter of the Scots, as the locals had a long-standing enmity with the Spanish. Turnbull had become good friends with Captain Pedro, his son-in-law, which blossomed into a military alliance before the attack. The combined Scot-Cooner attack on the Spanish troops was successful, a victory beyond any expectations. The Spanish were repelled back into the jungle mist, but a tactical victory doesn't necessarily spell a strategic victory. The Spanish had superior forces, as well as access to much more supplies, so their next move was a sound one. They blockaded New Caledonia from land and sea, and surrounded Fort St. Andrew with trenches and cannons, slowly advancing them towards the stronghold. After 1 month of brave resistance, the Scots capitulated at the end of March 1700. Darien became another of Spain's possessions. The Spanish were merciful and allowed the surviving colonists to evacuate with their possessions on their remaining ships. But the ordeal, it was not over yet, as months at sea can always be treacherous. And so it was that 350 more men and women died on the way back. Only a handful ever returned to Scotland. The Darien venture and the New Caledonia colony had been a complete disaster for Scotland. The blow to Scottish morale was crippling. The death rate had been 71% of all settlers. The surviving leaders of the expedition were faced with accusations, mostly well-founded, of incompetence and infighting. The same accusations extended to the other survivors, who were unjustly ostracized by their fellow citizens, sometimes by their own families. The young settler, Roger Oswald, for example, was disowned by his own father. Colonel Campbell came out of the affair with honour, at least. He was awarded the Tobacanti Medal for his part in defending New Caledonia. The expeditions that caused deeper economic disaster. The Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies had lost more than half of their initial capital of £400,000, most of which was raised from the life savings of many ordinary Scottish citizens. As a nation, Scotland was now entirely bankrupt and incapable of maintaining its economic independence. Queen Anne succeeded William of Orange on the English throne. The Queen and her cabinet had to endure yet another war, the War of Spanish Succession. They realized that, although financially strong, England lacked manpower to fight in the conflict, sustain the economy, and maintain the empire, and Scotland could provide that manpower. So they once again considered extending a proposal of union to the Scottish estates. Now the Scottish Parliament was in a position of weakness because the economy, already in dire straits, had been sunk by the Darien failure. When the English Parliament presented their proposal for an Act of Union, it included an enticing clause. London would pay to Edinburgh a sum of £398,000, most of which went to cover the Company of Scotland's losses. This payment became known as the equivalent, or the price of Scotland. And it is still debated, but apparently William Paterson had a hand in ensuring that this proposal would be financially favourable to Scotland. He died 12 years later, in 1719, in London. The Scottish estates accepted the proposal, and from then on, England and Scotland became two nations formally united under one monarch and one parliament, with a shared foreign and defence policy. In other words, a united kingdom. It's easy to argue that the UK would have never become a naval, military, political, or economic power if it had stayed disjointed as separate sovereign entities. Still, the Act of Union was not welcomed by all Scottish citizens. To some, the estates simply accepted a bribe from London in the form of the equivalent. Either by corruption or ineptitude, they had sold their nation's independence. This resentment led to further Jacobite uprisings in 1715 and 1745. Years later, the Scottish national bard Robert Burns lamented as such the Act of Union. "O would, before I had seen the day, that treason thus could sell us. My old grey head had lain in clay with Bruce and loyal Wallace. But pith and power, till my last hour, I'll make this declaration. We're bought and sold for English gold, such a parcel of rogues in a nation." And so today's exploration draws to a close. A company founded on the basis of a brilliant idea, an expedition that sailed halfway around the world to found a utopia, only to clash with the harsh reality of inexperience, the hostile schemes of other powers, and the unyielding challenges of the natural world. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and don't forget to subscribe. When you're subscribing, make sure you hit the notification bell so you find out when we put out a new video. And as always, I'll see you next time.